Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our staff and our partners tonight at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's live stream presentation of Thomas McGuane and Eric Johnson, part of our Arts and Culture series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, mytownhallseattle.org. We hope you were able to reach the program easily, fingers crossed, and are enjoying the benefit of accessing your tickets and events in one virtual location. Like everything at Town Hall, it is decidedly a work in progress. So if you have any questions or concerns, please use the patron services email you'll find in the chat. Tonight's conversation will run around 60 minutes, including your Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat below the video player. You may have to scroll down to see it, but please feel free to add yours at any time. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but if you keep yours succinct, we'll be able to get to plenty of them. For those who like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new events and podcasts every day, even as we begin to see light at the end of the virtual event tunnel and a return to in-person gathering. Upcoming programs include Gina Warren, investigating the phenomenon of backyard chickens, with experts Nicole Graham and a person so expert he's called Chicken Mike. Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth discussing this year's report on the state of the free press from Project Censored, as well as appearances by Sebastian Junger and Annette Gordon-Reed and Dr. Temple Grandin. The last concert of this year's Global Rhythm series featuring Calypso activist songwriter Drew Gonsalves and Cobo Town. And last, we're excited to announce our newest artist in residence, visual artist and storyteller Timothy White Eagle, with a residency featuring in-person programs, actually, exploring Native American and other earth-based spiritual practices. You can check out more of what's upcoming at Town Hall on our online calendar, townhallseattle.org. Our work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Arts and culture programs in particular are supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, the Norcliffe Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you know by now, I say it all the time, Town Hall is a member-supported organization. Underneath it all, I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight's program. One last note, you will most definitely want to dive deeper into tonight's conversation, and you can purchase copies of books by our speakers at Third Place Books using the link you'll find below the chat for our partner bookseller, Third Place. All right. Thomas McGuane is an American writer with a career spanning 4 decades. He began contributing fiction to The New Yorker back in 1994. He's written, that can't possibly be right. At any rate, he'll correct me, I'm sure, once we get into the flow. He's written 10 novels, including the 1974 National Book Award nominated 92 in the Shade, later turned into a full-length feature of the same name. McGuane has also written 6 collections of nonfiction essays, 2 short story collections, and a screenplay, while several other works have been pretexts for films and TV movies. His work has been anthologized in the Best American Stories, Best American Essays, and Best American Sporting Essays compilations. And his most recent book, 2018's Cloudbursts, Collected and New Stories, was named one of Wall Street Journal's best books of that year. Eric M. Johnson is an American journalist, author, and outdoorsman. His current journalistic focus is aerospace, from Boeing's 737 MAX crisis to Elon Musk's SpaceX. Though since joining Reuters in 2011, he has also covered President Barack Obama's re-election campaign, breaking national news, and transportation generally. He's also been a staff reporter for the Sun-Times Media Group and covered sports for The Observer in London. His debut novel, Whenever a Happy Thing Falls, was released in March of this year and is now out in paperback. Born and raised in Chicago, he's now resident of Seattle. And Eric, we're glad you're here, and I will make this now my solemn vow. Next time, we'll do it in our building. Our speakers tonight will draw on their experiences as writers living and dreaming fiction in a mostly material world. Please join me in welcoming Eric M. Johnson and Thomas McGuane.
Thank you so much, Ware.
Thank you so much. I'm joining in, trying to get the rhythm of Zooming here and who's next and stuff like that. So hello, we're glad to be here. I'm glad to be here with Eric. It's corresponded enough so that I think we have some consanguinity. And my screen just went blank. Is that real? Is that okay?
Oh, I can see you, Tom.
Okay.
Ware, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And Tom, personally, I want to thank you for joining me. You know, we talked over emails a bit about how, you know, generally about where we were going to start. But I noticed that every email that we had together usually started with a discussion around fly fishing. So I thought I would start there and talk about a topic that is not just important to you personally, but, you know, in the realm of conservation, really, really important to the Northwest and the nation. And in The Longest Silence, which is, in my view, the best collection of writing on fly fishing out there, you wrote, "We have reached a point in the life of the planet and humanity's demands on it, when every fisherman will have to be a river keeper, a steward of marine shallows, a watchman on the high seas. We are beyond having to put back what we have taken out. We must put back more than we take out." And I wanted to start there because, you know, you're seeing during COVID, you've seen a lot of people rush to the rivers, a lot more fly fishermen and women. And I wanted to ask you, you know, what you're seeing in Montana and how that's affected your experience with the sport.
Well, I mean, I'm just seeing an enormous amount of pressure on the resource, but it's just emblematic of the pressure on the planet in general. I mean, I think we really sense it because we are out there where we can see in a sort of microcosmic way how things are going downhill. I feel sort of guilty about it because I gave Robert Redford A River Runs Through It, which created this chaos of new anglers everywhere. But I think, you know, as I heard you reading that, I just wondered if there was anything particularly unique about that, in that the sort of slow burn alarm that everyone feels about what's happening to the planet. We're really feeling it in Montana because we have a really anti-wildlife administration here. We have a governor who sort of campaigned on the basis that he had trapped and murdered a wolf, you know, and we've spent years now recovering the wolves, and there are probably 700 or 800 pairs in the state, and they're now determined to reduce it to 2 to 4 pairs. Idaho wants to reduce 90% of the wolf population, which took 30 years to recover. The fish are oppressed in the rivers. Nice people like my wife tells me that she feels sorry for fish. This is very hard on a lifelong angler. But it's just one place to read what's happening. I mean, it's one place to read what's happening. I have friends who are sort of naturalists who go all over the world looking at the natural world, and I remind them that there's no better way to spread disease and aviation fuel than traveling to look at, rainforests. So I mean, we're at the point, whether we're anglers or anything else, it's really going to take a spiritual change to get out of this sort of death spiral that we're in the way we're using the place.
Right.
So, but I feel very strongly, because I've been a fisherman since I was a little boy, and I was probably a little predator, and then I was a predator for many years. Probably I was always trying to succeed as an angler, and I'm sort of not that way anymore. I love to fish, I love to succeed, but I love to see whatever that context of fishing is, whatever the context of rivers is. Particularly, most of the American population lives on the edge of the sea or on the edge of rivers. And so it's not a bad place to be alert, or to be vigilant about what you think is going on. And I mean, Eric, there was just a long piece in the Billings Gazette this last week that the population of trout is catastrophically dropping in Montana. Yeah. And nobody, we used to have closed seasons. I mean, the seasons are open during spawning season now in Montana.
Right.
We're just doing these destructive things. But in the sort of post-fact world, you can't point these things out, that we're going backwards on maintaining one of the natural resources that we're dealing with.
Right. And you mentioned a spiritual change. It's interesting because, you talk to fly fishermen, you talk to hunters. A lot of people are restricting their own, specifically on fly fishing. I mean, I'm only swinging flies for steelhead. But you do see a lot of Instagramming and a lot of, energy around just catching all the fish you can. And so I just keep having this thought in my head that there's going to be an end where there's going to be just massive closures, or the resource will be so depleted it'll never come back. I mean, I don't want to be too doomsday about it, but do you feel that way, or do you see glimmers of hope?
Well, I think we're going to have to respond. I mean, for one thing, on the sort of emotional, spiritual end, we're killing a tremendous amount of fish on Instagram. You're not supposed to take fish out of the water. Right. And then once you get into that and you start thinking about, the well-being of all sort of creatures, including fish, and then you try to figure out what your role as a sort of a long-term predator is. It just takes a while to work it out. I can't pretend I have. On the other hand, the great thing about people like fishermen, or even hunters and other things, is that you have to have stakeholders in the natural world. You have to care about it. For example, at the turn of the 20th century, the antelope were virtually extinct, and hunters brought them back.
Right.
But nobody else really cared about them. It's a shame that it has to be that way, and I've seen such terrible things done by hunters in recent times. I went up and rode up on the back of this ranch last year, and there was an elk, a young female elk, who had her legs shot off, and I know she'd been there for a week because I remember when they came through. And that it's not sufficiently deplored even by the sort of woke hunting community. Right. And that's going to have to change, but it's just too many of us. Right. I have a friend said, I said, what are we going to? He said, we've done everything to control population. What do we do next? And he said, we're going to have to spray them. But when I read, as I did recently in the New York Times, that people are concerned about the population plateauing out. We're not adding population. China's in a panic about not breeding fast enough. Japan has been in that panic for years. It's just so crazy. Right. we have too many people. We shouldn't worry about the fact that we're having fewer of them. And that's the human impact on the planet is what the whole, this is the Anthropocene, and it's not going to last forever. The biomass on the planet of insects is much larger than ours. They're waiting their turn in deep time. So we'll just have to see what happens. But I'm probably too old to change my habits. I'll probably go fishing as soon as this is over.
I believe you, knowing that in our email exchanges, you were going to fish in a storm, in a snowstorm.
Yeah, I know. It was snowing yesterday while I was fishing. It's beautiful here today, but we're kind of over. It was miserable over in Ennis when I left this morning. It's beautiful here.
And look, not to dwell on the negative. So one positive fishing question. So is it right that you landed your all-time best tarpon just a few weeks ago at 160 pounds? Is that right?
Yes. I tell everyone, I said, it's not a world's record, but it's a world record for 81-year-olds.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, it's amazing.
I don't know how long that'll last. But yes, I mean, I must say it was very exciting. It was a kind of a landmark for me. It was, I sometimes wonder if that's sort of sub-adult,
Right.
I don't know. I guess I'm not going to find out, but I think most people I know who fished are you a lifelong fisherman?
I grew up fishing. I grew up in Chicago, so I did bass fishing with my dad. I didn't get into fly fishing until in earnest until 2013 when we moved out to the Northwest, and so I came to it in a roundabout way.
Yeah, but most people who, for some reason or another, who are fishermen, were kind of just dawned on them. It was like some sort of inherent in their natures, and that was the case for me. I remember my father took me over to his aunt's house in Massachusetts, and there was a little stream along the edge of the yard, and I crawled over. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I looked into the stream, and there are all these little brook trout kind of hovering at the stream, and I had what they thought was an epileptic seizure. I was so overwhelmed to see fish, and I still think that a big part of fishing is you just want to look at them. Or
Right.
Some people want to look at them. I want to look at them. There was a Russian writer who wrote about this. Prishvin was his last name, Prishvin, and he had a similar epileptic episode seeing his first fish. So it's pretty profound for some people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to say,
I read a thing about Chekhov, who's our saint. Those of us who write fiction. And somebody said he was such a equitable human being, even when he had tuberculosis, was writing and seeing patients all day long. So they never ever saw him lose his temper or be unpleasant unless somebody criticized his fishing. And then he just lost all composure and argued. Yeah,
I can relate to that for sure. So yeah, I promised the good people of Town Hall Seattle we wouldn't fill the entire time talking about fly fishing. So I do want to pivot to, the main event here, which is, your life, your work, your books. And I guess the place I really wanted to start was with character development. And the Guardian newspaper wrote this. He said, his books deal with the general preoccupations of American life, marriage, infidelity, debt, aging, and the way in which people explain their own actions to themselves. Small-scale human strife is played out against a vast, indifferent landscape. And as I came to your writing, it's real Americans grappling with real things. And, a couple driving from the Gallatin Canyon to Idaho to sell a car dealership, an architect in a small town who has a jarring encounter with a young couple. I wanted to ask you how you're drawn to those types of characters, and then how you develop them.
Well, first of all, I would say that's why I think it's a good idea that you started your writing career as you did, immersed in day-to-day reality. And I would also say that a lot of young writers don't do that. They learn, it's not bad, it's obviously producing some great writers, but to sort of live in a purely literary world, and then is a little bit limiting, I think, in some ways. And I think there are too few younger writers have had this world experience that you've had. But I don't really, I sometimes wonder, I wonder how I ever start anything. I mean, Sherwood Anderson used to talk about getting the pitch right. No, actually, it was Faulkner who said that. Just getting the pitch right. Sometimes you're running down an image that haunts you for one reason or another. It turns up, and I've had them turn up in my dreams. I don't know what they mean. They have as one of their features that they don't go away, and you have to assume they're rooted in some way. And so you start writing, and it's just kind of, you start throwing paint. I think that the best way to do that is to be very committed to revision, because what happens in the sort of conscious, subconscious threshold is kind of wasteful in a way. You just generate a lot of stuff that's useless as you kind of do this Sam Spade kind of thing, like try to run down something that doesn't really live in your consciousness. And then you get a story starts to coalesce around it, but it only happens, at least for me, it only happens through revision. I just have to feel completely free to make mistakes. Because if I, there used to be a sort of business expression, you can't make decisions if you can't make mistakes. And I think it applies to writing.
Well, that's very interesting, because it's interesting, but it also terrifies me, because I wrote the first draft of my novel in Zagreb, Croatia. My wife and I moved there for a year, and I had just quit my, awful, stressful job in investment banking. I was just spending the money and living this like glamorous writer's life. But I came back to the States with, 300 pages single spaced in Microsoft Word. And it was this sprawling, Faulknerian type stream of consciousness thing with a little David Foster Wallace mixed in. It was a mess. And so it took me a long time to kind of, pull from it the narrative, but it seems like you relish that maybe. I mean, you told Charlie Rose, I think a few years ago, that Cadence of Grass was 500 pages in longhand before you got to the center of it, as you described it. Is that, am I right about that?
It is. I mean, there are several ways you can test that you can use. The one I was just in that interview I just did with in the New Yorker. One test is that it really works. I got from Robert Stone. He said, when you're looking at something, if you think there's something wrong, there's something wrong. And the other test is the Henry James test, which is there is only one test of fiction, which is it interesting?
Oh,
and between those two, those are pretty good navigational signs where you're going. And then I've never really been as aggressive about concentrating in a short story anyway as I was in the story Balloons. It was that's been through about 15 drafts, and it's been long.
Wow,
it's
great
smaller,
story.
but it's been smaller and smaller and smaller. And before I turned it loose, I just kept looking at it, and I kept thinking, what can I throw out?
Interesting.
Without losing something here.
And is that you've mentioned previously, a critique of American literature, if I understood it right, that length is a problem. And can you psychoanalyze that? Why do we write so long? I mean, what's going on there?
Why does who write so long?
Well, American writers. We were talking before about David Foster Wallace. I mean, you can point to a lot of examples, but
yeah, and some of them are just great writers, and I'm careful not to. This is not for me in a sense. I mean, I think when you look at, for example, The Great Gatsby today would be called a novella. Wouldn't be called a novel at all. And so that's just simply changed. And I think part of it is just economic, as literary fiction tries to compete in the world that is kind of dominated by bigger, more popular kinds of books. And we see it a lot, especially in young writers. I talked about this before. Young writers write this collection of brilliant stories, and I won't name the young writers who've done this, and then they get a contract to write a novel, and they write this bulbous thing that often ends their careers. Because up till then, people thought they were fascinating writers. After that, they say, "Oh, I didn't realize how dull this writer was. Let's not look again." So it's hard. I mean, it's hard to say. It's such a brutal trade for anybody to make a living in it. And some of the maneuvering that was possible when I was a younger writer. I mean, you could just sort of arbitrarily say, I'm broke, I'm going to Hollywood until I get some money, then I'm going to go back home and I'm going to do something until I'm broke again, then I'll go back out there. And you could just kind of come and go if you're willing to do that, or you could do journalism. I mean, I remember in the 70s when I did some movie work, it was considered to be ruinous to your literary career. I mean, yeah, I mean, it was worse than selling heroin on a playground. People say, "Oh, movies, you soiled yourself."
Right.
I don't think that's true anymore. But it's a survival scramble, especially for somebody who only wants to do that, which I think at this point in time is probably unrealistic.
Right. I think for me, it was like I had this. I mean, I loved fiction and I loved writing, and I was editor-in-chief of the college paper, et cetera. But then I thought for some reason I had to go. I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to make as much money as I possibly can to finance the writing, right? So 10 years will go by, I'll have all the money I need and all the time to write. But that's just a farce, because I lasted 8 months in investment banking. Granted, I did get the inspiration for characters and a novel from it, but right. I felt like I kind of felt like, almost like it was a waste. I wish I just went right into the act of writing, and reporting. So.
Well, I'm not so sure it's a waste. First of all, I mean, you're a noticer, you're an observer. You learn more that you can use than you probably realize yet. It'll sort of come back in the form of nightmares. But the other thing is, if you have to do something else, I remember if you write one story that's as good as Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, you're immortal. You can do that in the middle of a banking career in terms of the invested time. And I remember Barry Hannah. I don't know if you all remember Barry Hannah. He's dead now. He's a brilliant writer from Mississippi, and he and I were friends. And we used to say, we just want to be on the team. We don't need to be Nobel Prize winners, but we revered literature so much that if somehow or another we could add a drop or two to what others have done, and we can sort of be on the team. At that point in time, the romance of what we were doing was so intense that was enough.
Right. Well, you're on the team, Tom. 10 novels, collection of short stories. The latest story in the New Yorker is fantastic. A quick question about Hollywood, because so I think it was 5 screenplays you've done, and you used to hang out with Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson and all this. And so, like, when you look back on that and then you compare it to now, like, how do you think about that era? I mean, is it, what are your thoughts on it?
It was a different era in the movies. I mean, it was the Wild West by comparison to what was going on today. I mean, you get an idea and you go out and you meet with producers and you'd sort of drop to one knee and make your pitch, and they would look at each other and they'd whisper and they'd say, okay, we'll make it. Or, I mean, they don't do anything. It's so deliberate now. I did this one, 92 in the Shade was bought by a producer, and he said, we'll never get this off the ground for 2 or 3 years. Don't you have something ready to go? And I said, yes, I do. And that was a lie. I didn't have anything ready to go. He said, okay, I'll be back up in 2 weeks, and we'll discuss this project which you've written. So I panicked. I went into my little boy's room for 14 days, and I wrote Rancho Deluxe, and he came up. And he went into my little boy's room, and he came out and he said, okay, we'll make it.
Wow.
That doesn't really happen anymore.
Right. And back to your books and your stories. What I love about them is there's bursts of tragedy, of course, but there's just such great humor in it. And like the laugh out loud humor, where like, you're sitting in a silent coffee shop reading and you burst out laughing because of it. And I just wanted to ask you, for a long time, like, so, why is humor so important and prominent in your work?
Well, a couple of things. One, the writers that I revered as a young writer were a lot of the Russians who wrote in what was called, translated as laughter through tears. And the great exemplar of that was Gogol. And I mean, when I started writing, comic writing was much more part of it. I mean, there was a so-called black humor movement and all those wonderful writers. I wish I could think of all their names now, but that was a sort of intense part of the literary world, whether it was Joe Heller or Bruce J. Friedman, or there were all these writers that were serious writers, but they were very funny. And
Right.
I come from an Irish family, and everybody's cracking jokes. And, I remember I was in Argentina one time, and these Argentine guys, pointed to this little town on the bottom of Revere. It says, all Irish people down there. And I said, well, what are they like? And he said, oh, the usual thing. He said they drink quite a bit. They have, fart jokes in the bathroom. And I said, this is very familiar. So I still kind of feel that way. I think that writing, it's like that old joke, the horse walks into a bar, and the bartender says, why the long face? And it's just writing that has basically a long face. I mean, if I have a problem with a writer like Joan Didion, for example, is you're signaled almost from the first sentence that this is going to be pretty sour stuff.
Right.
Right. And she's a great writer. I don't contest that. But the other writers that I've liked over years, I was just listening to a podcast, New Yorker podcast. It was Achiever Story, the David Rabe. Was it David Rabe? Yeah, David Rabe. No, it was an Updike story. But there, so much of it, and so much of the Achiever I think, was a phenomenal writer, and so much of his work was really quite funny. But it didn't, because of that, anymore. I mean, Don Quixote is probably my favorite book, and it's very heartbreaking book, really, but it's extremely funny throughout. And that kind of where those two things meet has always been something I really cared about.
I see.
So what, I haven't read your book yet, but I mean, what about that? Do you think you're funny? Is your book funny?
Well, I think I'm inspired by what you said. It's basically, it's a coming of age novel about a recent college graduate whose father, who's a shrewd businessman with ulterior motives, forces him to take a job in investment banking and give up his dreams of being a writer and this budding relationship with a precocious young actress. And so he's thrown into this toxic world of 100-hour work weeks and booze and drugs and high stress. And then, of course, the stuff that a lot of American companies are dealing with as far as, misogyny and racism in the office. And so his life falls off the rails during this. And so ultimately it's a redemption story. But the point on humor is it is some pretty sour stuff. And so you risk losing, in my view, what I thought, you risk losing the reader if you don't provide some comic relief. He accidentally takes amphetamines at one bender overnight, but he unexpectedly has the most productive day in the bank in his working in his job so far. So I feel like you just have to have that comedic relief. And I just personally like reading funny stuff, and it doesn't mean that it's not serious fiction. It doesn't mean that it doesn't alleviate the burden of being a human and all the aspirational things we talk about when we talk about fiction writing. But yeah, that's how I would say it.
Well, your subject obviously is something that could easily lead to satire. And satire is such a tricky thing because no matter what you do, I got a little message down here. Oh, do you work at the Senate over there?
Oh, so we have a question from the audience.
Okay, but let me just say this one thing is that no matter how beautifully satire is done, and I don't care if it's Saturday Night Live, without great caution, it leaves a sort of sour taste in your mouth. And it's very different than comedy. There used to be an old Broadway expression: satire is what closes on Saturday night. I mean, it's this thing that is really bracketed by its limitations.
Right, it's a very good point.
Yeah, it has a very short, it has a mayfly-like lifespan. I mean, it's, you know, it has this kind of remarkable quality and it's fun, but it's just quicker than cocaine. I mean, it comes and goes.
Right.
But we had a question here, and I'm going to see
Yeah.
who it's for. Where's that question?
So it says for Tom, do you work at the sentence level, moving from there out into paragraphs and the larger narrative structure, vice versa, or does it just depend?
Well, I think a sentence that seems to the ability to write a sentence that seems to resonate with whatever you might want to capture as you're writing. It can often start at that sentence level. Whether or not it lands in paragraphs or is something I'm not really sure about. I mean, one of the things in the 14 or 15 years I've been working at the New Yorker is I have an editor, Deborah Treisman, who is so good that it's given me a kind of freedom to sort of light out into areas that might be a little bit far-fetched in terms of the needs of the narrative, but I don't really think in those terms. I love prose, I love sentences, I love language, so to answer that question as best I can, I would say yes, I really bear down on sentences. They mean a lot to me, but how they go Lego style into other structures, I don't really have very strong feelings about.
Well, one follow-up on that is I'm going to paraphrase Liberty, but I think you told Deborah Treisman after Balloons was published something about, you know, you sometimes you write until there's an impasse, which can be terminal.
Right.
Is that yeah?
Yeah, well, I think that, and I'm sure you had that experience when you were writing this book. I mean, you get to a point where it's as simple as you don't know what's next.
Right.
And then the larger version of that is, maybe I'll never know what's next, and this project is dead. And so you look everywhere for solutions, and hopefully you don't try something flashy or mechanical or something to get out of it, because there used to be an ideal in narrative, which is that one perception should lead to another perception. In other words, there should be no yada yada, and there should be no blah blah blah. You know, and so that's a tough rule, and it's unrealistic to say we live up to it at all times. We can't. But what Deborah and I were talking about was the idea of, I think, as I recall, is the idea is you hit an impasse, but you're not without hope. Somehow or another, the idea seems to linger with possibility, and you wait for something that'll get you off the hook. Here's another one.
Right. Got another question. Some people use books to find their place in the world. In your writing, where are you trying to take people? Any particular mind space?
Well, the one I have a certain conviction about that, which is that there are a lot of other media that can't do what fiction does, which is they can't really replicate consciousness. For example, we'll talk about your Great Gatsby again. If you read The Great Gatsby and then look at the movies of that era, read the newspapers of that era, read the nonfiction of that era, and does any of it give you a feeling of what it was to be alive in 1926? And there's really I really only think that only literature can do that. Not that it occupies the cultural expanse it once held, but it still has this one irreducible thing, which is to give a reader now or in the future a sense of what it was like to be alive at that particular time. And that's actually, somebody once long ago said, what do we do? What is our job? We're in the consciousness business. We're trying to render consciousness in the sense of what it was like to be alive under whatever circumstances or whatever things makes delivering consciousness interesting. But nothing else can do it.
That's very well said. And Tom, I'm a journalist. I like to break news. Can you share with us what's coming up as far as your next story or novel or?
Oh, I wish I knew. I've never known. Uh, it's always, it's always start from scratch. I wish that would change. And then the other thing that is a little bit inhibiting is you gradually get better at what you're doing, or you gradually develop criteria about what your stuff should look like. And I wrote my first novel, I don't know, in 5 weeks or something. I was just this carefree guy, just blackening pages, and I'm not that guy anymore. I really know more about what it ought to be. So it's kind of a slow thing, but it still always comes back to this kind of world of impulse and dreams, and or reflections about your own life. As you talked about your book, I wonder, I said, is there some kind of embedded father-son conflict driving?
Well, no, it's funny you say that, because I have a great relationship with my dad, and he didn't, he's been very supportive of my writing. And so the way I came at it was basically when I was in this world of banking, like you said, I took almost a journalistic approach. I was literally, in the cubicle writing down some of the things my colleagues were saying, these horrifying, racist, whatever they were saying, or funny things or whatever. And that provided, some inspiration. And I think, initially there was one moment where I knew I had to write this specific book. I was, sitting in the office and, 80-hour work week or whatever. And one of the guys in the next cubicle, everyone's working away. And I got a phone call from a guy I played soccer with in college. And unfortunately, one of our teammates had died, and he was one of these freak accidents that comes out of nowhere. And so I, took this phone call, hung up, and the guy, 2 cubicles over, I asked what happened, and I told him, and he said, well, what an idiot, because the guy had been skateboarding. And so I literally grabbed a yellow legal pad, went down to a bar overlooking the Chicago River, and just sat there and wrote out, what became one of the first scenes in the book, when a senior managing partner comes and sees the analyst laying on the floor in the cubicle after like a 2-day work binge. And so I had to escape that world and get to writing. But I had plenty of inspiration from hearing the stories of these colleagues and being in that world to figure out the rest.
Well, and not everyone has the qualities of detachment to sort of watch the world from a certain distance. That's kind of an issue. I've never really had great detachment. I've known a lot of. Here comes another question. We're going to write about the tarpon. Well, I'm going to certainly think about that tarpon. I'll circle back to this, but because I wanted to talk a little bit about how ideas come to me, and I'll speak about the tarpon in a minute. I had this moment one time. We rented a house in Alabama at one time, and I went down there early, and the house just seemed strange to me. And I went into the house. It was on Mobile Bay. I went into the house, I walked around, and I'm not really good at being comfortable in new places. I just get, I just anxious a little bit. And so I walked into this house, I look around, and they had a porch looking out over Mobile Bay. I didn't even know the renter who had rented it. I didn't know who I would call if I had problems with the water or the plumbing. So I walked out the front door onto the porch and stepped out. It looked quite beautiful. And I turned around, I realized I'd locked myself out of the house and I didn't know anybody. It was just, and it's not a big deal. It just didn't happen in Belarus. This happened in Alabama. And, but I just remember this rising anxiety of not really being in control of my situation, who to call, who lives in Alabama anyway. My wife's from Alabama. That's about it for me. And, so that became the basis of a story, this feeling of these little things that change the atmosphere you're living in, that either through anxiety or something else make you realize you're not really sure what the deal is. And that kind of quality of uncertainty, I find dramatic, if I can get it down on the page. So, but let's go back to the tarpon.
Oh yeah.
It's a very nice person to talk. It's kind of an interesting fish. We were fishing in really bad conditions. There was a big onshore west wind, so we were fishing in swells, and it was very hard to keep standing up in the boat. And we drifted down into this area of about 4 feet of depth, and there were laid up tarpon at different depths in these swells. Mm-hmm. And it was just kind of interesting trying to get lined up on a fish. And so I got a cast that worked, and this fish just, but I mean, it's nothing like a big tarpon eating it. You cast a fly, which is tiny, and this bucket comes up that'll hold about 10 gallons that eats the fly. And so I got tight on this fish. He went off for about 200 yards in the first run and just did these crashing jumps, real violent, big, long, sprawling jumps. And then you have a kind of a chance, after they stop jumping, you have a chance where they're basically trying to catch their air. Mm-hmm. And if you kind of get on them at that point in time, you can land them fairly quickly. But if you don't, you're involved for hours. And one time, so I landed that fish in 8 minutes.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Yeah. And then another time I was with a group from an ocean trust organization. We were trying to put a satellite in a tarpon and to track it. And what do you call those little things? Yeah, it's a little satellite beacon, I guess is the word for it. And this fish never jumped. This fish was about 140 pounds. And it took, in 2.5 hours, we had it to the boat. And I was totally exhausted. But that was a fish that didn't jump. So anyway, any sort of PETA members in the audience are going to really loathe this anecdote.
Right, yeah, that's the risk we run with.
I know. Like, or even my wife, I mean, my wife would certainly, under those circumstances, would say, as she has said before, poor fish.
Right. Well, there's so many times I feel like I'm speaking to someone about fly fishing who doesn't do it. And they're always like, well, how'd the fish taste? And I'm like, no. Like the fish goes back. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. And, you know, I mean, I remember they closed the Bellacoola River, which I used to fish for steelhead, and they closed it because the First Nations, they call Native people in Canada, said, you know, fish are not to be played with. If you're not going to catch them and eat them,
right?
Yeah, we're not going to let you play with them, and they closed the river.
Right. Well, actually, I want to ask you about that because I can't remember where I saw it, but like there was someone was commenting that like it used to be where you'd have a limit. So you get on the river, you hit your limit, and you go home. Where now we're putting everything back, but you know, a good guideboat, you know, with two decent anglers can put 30 fish in the boat, you know, on a float. So it's like, you know, what are we doing here? Like, is catch and release? Has that gone to some like crazy, absurd extreme? I mean,
well, you know, I have a friend I fish with, the singer Huey Lewis, who's a crazed angler. He lives here in Montana, and he went to a Norman McLean reading. You all know Norman McLean, river runs through it. And he was with a friend who was a fishing guide. And at the end of the reading, the fishing guide went up to Norman McLean and he said, I really enjoy your work, and I'd like to take you in my boat to float the Bitterroot River. And Norman McLean said, that's not trout fishing. You don't fish out of the boat. You walk and find your way to the runs and the pools that you're actually fishing. He said, boat fishing is not trout fishing.
Wow. But now I know, I didn't know that you're to blame for, you know, a river runs through it spawned popularity in fly fishing. Now I know. So tell me about this. So you gave the book to Robert Redford, but now that I'm saying this, and now I think that I saw something about, there was an argument. Was there an argument?
Somebody said that. I don't remember an argument, but Redford came out and stayed with me for a while, and he had the rights to a book of mine, Nobody's Angel. And we were really struggling to figure out how to do it and how to get it financed and blah, blah, blah. And he said, geez, I just want to make a film here in Montana. And so I said, well, you got to read this book. I said, it's just a great little book, and it's very compact, and it's got a strong narrative structure that could be used, translated into film. So I gave him the book, and I mean, I've had to run for my life ever since then because it created this avalanche of fantasy anglers. I was
Right.
on an airplane with a guy that owned or managed a Spring Creek in Virginia, and he had a little fly shop there. And he said the number one thing he sold were creels, these big creels. And I said, well, isn't your stream catch and release? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, why do you sell creels? And he said, well, they saw creels in the movie and they just don't want to wear creels. So I know it had a big impact. I love the book, and I sort of like the movie, but my daughter Annie, who's now 40, was in the movie. She was a little kid in the picnic scene. I always go back to see what she looked like.
Oh, wow.
At 10, so.
Well, and now, I mean, now you look at, the sort of next iteration, a river runs through it, made a lot of people go into fishing. Now it's Instagram, and it's sort of like this, this like public persona. You're like broadcasting your fishing. You're like, everything's on video. You're taking photos of every fish. And
usually with heavy metal soundtracks. The heavy metal soundtracks.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know, it's like gone, it's gone completely to the other end of the spectrum. So like, I don't know, I just don't know where you go from there. Like, I don't know how we unring that bell. And I don't know, like, is it government is going to have to, shut fishing down for several years on the OP, on the Olympic Peninsula, for example, to allow the steelhead to, rejuvenate. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either. I just saw a question here from Candace about, as I recall, I think it was about where I think it's going.
She says, can you talk about what you see as the future of writing? What form and what purpose?
Well, it's changed a lot. I think what we so-called literary fiction is sort of like chamber music at this point in time. It's quite culturally isolated. I mean, not so long ago, people wondered what William Styron or Norman Mailer had to say about the culture, and it's very unlikely that literary fiction writers now are going to say, what do you think, what are your feelings about Donald Trump? We just don't get asked those questions anymore. Right. And I don't know whether it's because we're considered to sort of be irrelevant to the zeitgeist at this time. I don't think that's the case. But there's no question but that the arts, all the arts, have been kind of shrinking in terms of the landscape of available media. But everybody is suffering from that. I think that, the traditional movie industry is falling apart. Everything's now is Amazon or Netflix or these long form kinds of things. Anybody can start one of these strange podcasts, there's all these, and some of them very influential. Some of these terrifying right-wing podcasts that have emerged in the last 10 years are part of this new media landscape. Right. And it's very easy to start one of these things with your crackpot ideas and get 500,000 people following you. Right. I think it's, but Tom Brokaw lives near here, and he and I are friends, and he thinks that's the most menacing thing that's happened in American life.
Really?
It's the fact that people can generate these hopefully minority views and get a big following because of their incendiary quality, which is exciting. It's like in any kind of journalism, it's very hard to be a successful journalist writing good news.
Right. And you mentioned way earlier in the conversation, this post-fact world. And as a journalist, I mean, it's very difficult because you will talk to people, you'll interview people, and there's a distrust for the media. I mean, look, there's bad journalists out there, there's bad fishermen out there, but for the most part, we're just kind of stumbling around trying to get at the story. And it's a very pernicious element in American culture, and I don't know.
But it's it's kind of Schadenfreude has sort of infected journalism, so that the thing that really kind of drives breaking news or the front pages is sort of bad news, or people failing, or violence. I mean, we're all guilty of that. I mean, I pick up the Billings Gazette every morning because it's my neighborhood newspaper.
Mhm.
I find myself drawn to these horrendous stories, these kidnappings and stabbings and people driving their cars in front of. I mean, it's sort of what energizes newspapers, really.
Yeah, I mean, you are right, but I mean, I can't argue. I mean, it's like I'm in the news business, and there's that awful saying, "If it bleeds, it leads." I mean, that's just kind of the way it is, and there's been some efforts to like news sites devoted to positive news and all that, but if you're covering something, you want to get at what the people are not telling you, because there's legions of lawyers and public relations executives who tell you things, but you want to get at what a company or a politician or whoever's not telling you. And to do that, you have to dig. And sometimes you're digging for, the negative, which is, maybe it's just the way it is. I don't know.
My first editor, who now lives in Oregon, Gary Fiskajohn, and he started all those vintage classics. He did that whole series of things. But when he first got out of, he grew up on a mink farm in Oregon, and he's moved back there. He lives next to it now. But he was really a great editor, and he edited a lot of game-changing books in his day. But when he left, he went to Amherst to get out of there. He was obviously a brilliant boy, and he went to New York to do literary journalism. And he met with the real sort of forces, the old entrenched forces in literary journalism. And they all told him the same thing. They said, think of someone who seems to have a secure career and attack them. The only way to start your career is through attacking people. And I don't know if that's, I thought, well, what a strange business model that is. It's just
Right.
kind of works for sharks, it can work for us. So
Looks like we got
I
one
don't know
more
why
question
that's
here.
so new. Huh?
We got one more question here. So, Heart of the Game is one of the most thoughtful essays written on hunting. Have you written more hunting pieces, and might we ever see them?
And what was the last part of that?
And might we ever see them?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I have a very sketchy relationship with hunting now. I always have bird dogs, and I'm always hunting. I hardly ever shoot anymore. But when populations are really healthy, and we do a lot on the ranch to make sure they stay that way, I might hunt every day of the week for part of the day, and then I'll say to my wife, "Do you want to eat a couple of partridges on Sunday?" And in that same week, I could have shot 50 birds, and so I'll shoot 2. But the pleasure is the hunt, basically. But the thing that really set me back long ago is my daughter Annie, was an animal lover when she was 10 years old. She said to me, "Poppy, you really love to hunt, don't you?" And I said, "I really do." She said, "You love taking care of your bird dogs, and you love going every day, and you clean your gun at the end of the day and put it away, and you really love it, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well, I think you should keep doing it then." She said, "But I have to tell you, I think it's the saddest thing I've ever heard." And I mean, it just kind of rang in my ears, because there is a point of view. I mean, it's I forgot his name, but he was the head for the ASPCA, once said, "Why would you want to kill something that wished to live?" It's a huge question. I'm not a vegetarian, and I know how what suffering goes into leather shoes, leather seats and cars. I was going to write this comic children's book called "Mommy, Where Does Bacon Come From?" And the subtitle was "A Child's Guide to Hog Slaughter." So, but we do all these things that down the way, where we can't see them, are really quite cruel. I mean, eating chicken is very cruel, really, if you do it. And I find it's less cruel to hunt. And I don't, it does not supply all my food needs. But my wife is a vegan. I don't mind eating like that way, or I'll eat anything somebody else will make. But at the same time, I think it's a good thing to hunt and find out how you get meat. I mean, most people haven't a clue. I remember years ago they were going to try to get a black rhino for the Brooklyn Zoo, and they were doing a fundraiser to import a black rhinoceros for the zoo, and they did a poll of the people who come and go through the Brooklyn Zoo, and they found that 75% of the people who go to the Brooklyn Zoo had never seen a chicken. And so what was the point in getting a black rhino? But that's how detached we are from such things.
Right.
So how detached we are from such things. It's crazy. I mean, I miss the day, fishing day, back when I was a young fisherman, you'd come home and you'd have all those little trout laid out in your creel. You'll clean trout and you'd have trout for dinner. It was great. I may go back to it. I don't know.
Right.
Oh, what was Candace's question? Will we do? Will I do more of that? I probably will. It's going to be just really by the standards of the hunting literature these days. I think what I would have to do would seem fairly effete to the NRA crowd.
Right.
So.
Yeah. One more question I had for you is, if you look at the articles that have been written on you, as far as profile pieces, there's people mention that you're a writer in the Western tradition, or a Montana writer. I mean, in the sense that, like, if you think about Algren, you think Chicago. If you think Faulkner, you think Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi. Do you feel that way, that you're a Montana writer or a Western writer, or do you feel like an American writer?
No, I don't. I don't feel like a regional writer particularly. And there's a lot of pressure about that, or there was in Montana, because we had these sacrosanct writers like A.B. Guthrie and The Big Sky and all those kinds of things. And sort of the Chamber of Commerce always asks about people like me or my friends Bill Yortzberg or Jim Harrison. Why don't you write like A.B. Guthrie? Although Harrison kind of did, what was that great book he wrote? Legends of the Fall, it was kind of in the local tradition more, but the rest of us are writing about contemporary life. And I used to be sort of annoyed with the Western expectation of what you should write, because I never saw people I actually knew turning up in these books. You never saw anybody who had a secretarial job or drove a pizza truck or all those kinds of things, or had kids in school, or went to PTA meetings, or emergency medicine people, all those kinds of things that were the people you knew, were never in the Western books that I read.
Right.
So that to that extent, I wanted to sort of revise the idea of what Western writing would be like. But I wouldn't hesitate to set a novel in London if that's what interested me. I don't think, and we don't live that way anymore. I mean, when I was a youngster, I never knew anybody who went to Europe. Or had gone to Europe when I was a kid, but now everybody's going. All the 8th graders in Sweetgrass County have been to Europe. So it's not the same world, and treat a place like some sort of kabuki theater, and that was kind of my beef with McLean and with Wallace Stegner and all these people. They sort of pretended there was this kind of little theatrical world called the American West.
Interesting.
I just it doesn't appeal to me.
Interesting. And on the topic of pursuing your dreams in a material world, you mentioned to an interviewer, I'll just read this. In 1968, I came straight from the writing workshop at Stanford. I think I had $600 left for my fellowship. And while I was there, my first book was published. And I thought at some point I'd figured out where I was going to live and what I was going to do. And I had applied for teaching jobs at about 30 places, and I got not one reply. But then my first book came out, and it made a little bit of money, and there was a movie sale, and allowed me to avoid making the decision. And 50 years came and went. So I wanted to ask you, just for some comic relief, before you were famous, what or any jobs that you recall doing, to
menial. They were all menial. I worked on a ranch when I was in high school. I worked in gas stations. I had a trick. I worked in a gas station, learned how to do brake jobs, and I came out and with a friend of mine, and we could do brake jobs. And all these ranch vehicles needed brakes, or needed the brakes. So we were kind of popular for a while until all the ranchers in the area got their brakes fixed, and then they realized we didn't know anything.
Right.
But I was really proud when I moved to Montana. I was living out south of Livingston, and this tough old lady. I shouldn't tell the story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Tough old lady who owned the OTO ranch, and she was this real hardcore native Montanan. She came up to my place and she said, looked at me and sort of looked me up and down, and she said, "You don't know anything, do you?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And she said, "Well, at least you don't have a big ass like the locals." And I thought, what an imprimatur. And I remember feeling, well, that's going to have to do for the time being. I didn't know anything. And what had happened is I bought this place. I mean, this is shocking. I found the notes from the purchase of the place I bought in 1969. It's the headquarters of an old ranch. It was not a lot of acreage. It was like 40 acres. It had an orchard, turn of the century house, barns, outbuildings, a stream. And it was $14,000. And those days have come and gone, but it was
Right.
back in there, nobody wanted to be in Montana, or not nobody wanted to be here, but it was a cheap place to live, that's for sure.
Right. That's not the case anymore.
Oh my God, we're in this unbelievable boom around here right now. I don't know what. I went through Bozeman yesterday, and I hadn't been to Bozeman in about 8 months, and I just didn't recognize it.
Wow.
It's just exploding. I went to Costco to get some reading glasses, and Costco's sitting in this place on all these little broken lots, and there are hotels all in these lots and other big box stores. And you get into Costco and you try to figure out how you're going to get out of here, because there's been no plan. You just have to wind your way through buildings and try to find the street you left to go to Costco and get your reading glasses, and you think you're losing your mind. I think you're just trapped in this rat maze of poor planning.
Right.
And that's what the explosion is. Here we go.
Oh, we have another question. Okay, what advice do you have for new writers? Anything you would have done differently if you were starting your literary career over again?
Well, I think that I don't probably have very good advice for new writers, except that in my case, and in the case of a lot of other writers I've known, writing seems to come from reading. And I wouldn't know how to suggest to start writing without doing lots of reading. Now, what kind of reading? It's whatever turns you on, just any kind of reading. But living in an immersion of words and ideas, it tends to kind of suggest your own, or you begin to imagine the book that hasn't been written yet. Or in other words, you begin to recognize your own individuality and begin to imagine that you have something to say. And that comes from reading. The other thing is, the French writer Jean Cocteau said, "A writer should never do anything hard." I mean, it's sort of interesting stuff, but you should got to get out of the mode of thinking that this is punishment, or this is going to be painful. The second thing that Cocteau said was somebody asked him, what's the first thing a writer should do? And he said, get dressed. And I told that to my friend, great writer, Miley Malloy, who lives on the West Coast now. She's from Montana. And she said, but we became writers so we wouldn't have to get out of bed. I think that's a little bit off center. It's not quite true, but you do have to get back to the idea that it can be fun. When Faulkner wrote As I Lay Dying in a pretty short time, and it's a very painful book. It's a painful, sad book. And he said it was fascinating to compare the reviews and the criticism of the book that described the incredible suffering that went into the writing of it, And he said, I compared that to all the pleasure I had writing that book and what fun it was. So to answer that question, I would say you should try to find a way to make writing pleasurable. I hate to keep using the word fun because it's trivializing, but it should be kind of fun in a way. You should, a good day of writing should be one of the best days you can have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. They're hard to track down. They come and go. They're elusive. You have one really good productive day writing, you really can't have a better day than that.
And you mentioned, I mean, when you talk about, wanting to fish more versus writing and the impetus of needing to stay indoors and write. I mean, what if it's not coming? You're sitting there and you're trying to blacken a page, as you once put it. Like, do you go fishing? Do you go, jump in the tractor, ride a horse? What do you do?
Well, one of the regrets I have about my writing life is that when I was a young writer, I just sat there. I just stayed, whether it was working or not working. I look back, I remember my painter friend, Russ Chatham, came by, and I'd been in the office for days, not getting anything done, just burning time. And he was on his way to go down to the Yellowstone to fish. And he wanted to know if I wanted to fish. I said, no, I'm just gonna stay here until something happens. And he started out the door and he turned back and he said, I just couldn't live that way. And I couldn't live that way now. And most of my life, I couldn't live that way. But I think I just, I certainly gave away a lot of the years of my life not really getting that much done. But you can't just quit easily either. You can't quit easily. But the other thing is that about writing is once you have something underway, it just gets a lot easier. So it's important to make some kind of a start. I mean, I taught at Berkeley one year, and I just said, if you can't say something intelligent, say something stupid, but just write something. And just find out that this is not an impossible threshold to get one of your ideas, even if it's moronic. Get it from your head to the page and see if you can go someplace from there. But to try to do this ratiocinate approach to writing, where you're going to do this all in your head and nothing ever comes of it.
Right. That's great advice. How are we doing on time? I've lost track of where we're supposed to be.
Well, I'm going to interview you now.
Oh, right. No, I like asking the questions, Tom. I'm better.
Well, the only thing I remember this anecdote about Waylon Jennings. He was talking to a young country and western musician who was working on an album. He had it under contract. And Waylon Jennings said to him, take your time. Just take your time and take as long as you want, because once that's done, it's going to be next for the rest of your life.
Interesting. Yeah.
And there's you've written one now, so you're at this kind of threshold, but you can prolong this, and just realize you still own it, unless they're supporting you with sort of incredibly gracious circumstance, and you owe them for it. You don't owe anybody anything. You just owe yourself the prospects for doing your next good book. And if you can combine that with the idea that this book isn't right, or it isn't the book I wanted to write until I say it's right, until you look at it and you say, God, I did it. Or as an old gunsmith told me, you get to a point where further effort won't make it better than it's done.
Right.
So, but you're really kind of alone on this.
See, that's really interesting, because like when you're getting your book ready to be published, I'll read over parts again, and I'll say, I wish I would have cut that word, or this dialogue could have been a little different. But I feel like the last 30-ish pages of the book, I'm just really proud of. I know I nailed it, and I wouldn't change it at all. And it doesn't matter who tells me it, that's not changing.
Right.
So.
I think that, yes, exactly. I remember when I wrote 92 in the Shade, I was just finishing the book. I was in Montana, set in the Keys. And And I remember it was time to eat Thanksgiving dinner, and I thought I was within paragraphs of finishing this thing, and I sort of semi-accidentally bit the inside of my mouth, so blood was coming out of my mouth, and I had to go in and say, "I can't eat. Look," and I ran back in and finished the book. But at that point, I've been writing so obsessively on that book, I could recite it. It was almost 200 pages long, and I could recite it.
Right.
Now, that hasn't been the case ever again. Ah, there it is, that old devil. That
I just pulled
artifact.
from the stack of your books as I sit here.
That artifact. But I think that you have to believe that what you're doing, what you do is important, that what you know, your consciousness is something that nobody else has.
Right.
And that it's important for you to bring that into the world, to give birth to it somehow. Through these little strategies we're talking about, through being interesting, through doing careful work, to know so much about what you're doing that you can do it effectively. So to answer Constance, was that her name, Constance? To answer her question is, you have to read a lot. You have to read all the time.
Yeah, and yeah, no, when you were talking, I just remembered what the New Yorker reviewed one of your books. It was The Cadence of Grass, and they wrote, McGuane's sentences are like no one else's, crisp and spare, yet somehow baroque. And he perpetually balances the picaresque against the sublime. I thought that was really, when you were speaking, that's what I was reminded of that.
Oh, well, I hope it's true, but I think that in some level, I'm a person of relatively high anxiety. I've learned to trade, retrain it into this sort of machismo posturing. So, but I really worry about wasting people's time when I'm writing. And I think that's been the big driver in my prose style, such as it is that I just think, that, for some reason or another, somebody's reading this, they chose to do that. I'm just not going to waste their time. I'm going to engage them, and I'm going to make them go where I think they should go, but I'm definitely not going to waste their time if I can help it. And that sort of has a way of coalescing your prose. It hasn't always been the case. I haven't always lived up to it. You can't really, but it ought to be a sort of a base idea. And it's nice, if you have a great editor, as I do at the New Yorker, who will sort of bring me in line, by my own things she knows I wish I wanted to do or wanted to accomplish. And maybe I'm misfiring, It's a very imperfect trade. I mean, it's, if Yates could spend 3 months on 12 lines, the level of perfection that you're hoping for in a novel or even a short story, I mean, it's unachievable, but you just do as well as you can. And you ought to have good principles, and they ought to be based on reading good books.
Right. Yeah, no, it reminds me of my own editor, who a woman named Mary Wisniewski in Chicago, and she wrote the definitive biography of Nelson Algren. And the advice she gave me after the first draft was, it's okay to have bad characters, evil characters, but the reader has to have someone to root for. And her point was that it was too negative. It was too much. Everybody was an asshole. And it was very helpful advice, though, because I reminded me what you said about satire, the risk of going too far, but yeah, no, I think I do agree in that it's like you're entertaining people, right? You're there, you want them to find, pleasure in reading what you write. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I've approached it. Is it frozen? Uh-oh.
He is frozen for me.
I think he's frozen. We can wait a little bit.
Oh, I think we lost him.
Well, it sounds like a good place to end then.
Yeah, I guess so.
Dramatic exit from Tom
Yeah,
McGuane. Predictable.
we are, you know, at our time, so I think this is a great place to end.
That's great. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. I really appreciate it, and it was a great conversation. It was great to see Tom, and yeah.
Yeah, it was a really fun conversation to listen in on. At times nostalgic, but also very relevant and modern. So it was really fun to listen to. So thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. Really appreciate the
Um,
opportunity.
Yeah, and I want to thank the audience as well. Thanks for your questions and your engagement. I want to encourage you, if you're interested in purchasing either Eric's or Tom's book or both, use the links in the chat, and that'll take you right over to Third Place Books, so you can purchase from a local store. But you know, Eric, sometime we'll see you in person, I'm sure, in the coming months. But until then, I hope you stay safe and have a great night.
Thank you so much.